Let us take a few moments and meditate. As our breathing gradually goes from conscious observation to just the automatic breathing that we do, let us think a little bit about the pillars of trust and the sentiments that go together with trust. I often start with a story, and today is not an exception. So once upon a time, actually a couple of years ago, when I was chairing a department at a university, I was involved quite closely in the hiring of new faculty members. And some of those folks had to come with their belongings from rather distant places, mostly in the country, but sometimes even from outside the country. And we had just extended an offer to a person. It was the late spring, and that offer was accepted. We were all very happy. The incoming professor had successfully negotiated a pretty decent amount to, not just for their pay, but a good amount to reimburse them for their move. But here there was a problem. The university had a policy that they would not pay money up front for something like this, only after the bills for the move had been submitted for payment. So in conversation with the person who was going to come and join us, let's call her Chris, not the real name, they explained that they had no money. Well, that was understandable. They didn't have a job yet. And so my empathy was coming to the surface. And they could not get a loan. They had no credit. And they really needed cash now so that they could rent that truck to come over. Well, after all our conversations, I'd come to know Chris pretty well in that interview process. So I sent her the money in cash. It was a 4-figure sum. And it was with the understanding that once that university check comes for the reimbursement, she would pay me back. Was this a wise move on my part?
No.
Do I hear no? Some people go, I don't know. So here's what happened next. The newly hired faculty member arrived on campus. The paperwork for the reimbursement was completed and was received by Chris. Then nothing happened. Yeah. And then Chris happily told us about her new apartment and how she was getting stuff for it. And I was beginning to be a little concerned. Sadly, as some of you may already have expected, I did not receive the money back that I had loaned, with the specific understanding that I would get it back at the time of reimbursement. And being the department chair, I knew that check had gone out. A few months later, I told Chris I really needed to talk to her. Her reply was rather indelicate. I guess you want your money back. I said, yes. And to which I received another reply, which was, I'll give you $250 as a down payment when I get my next paycheck. I felt as if it was I who had been asking for a handout. So I guess I shouldn't have trusted that person, at least not with this. And in this situation, at least, I rather felt betrayed at that point. And in telling this rather predictable story with a predictable ending, I used the word trust a few times. And when I started thinking about the theme for this month, which is living love through the practice of trust, I tried to formulate in my mind, what is it I really mean by trust? I know there are institutions and organizations that are called trust with a capital T, but I'm thinking about trust between individual people. Okay, so I went to the dictionary. What do they say? And good old Webster says, trust is an assured reliance on the character, ability, strength, or truth of someone or something. That sounds pretty good, but not really good enough to me, because trust and reliance, they're not the same thing. They are related. Then I read an article about trust and reliance and about the ethics of trust. It was written by two people who are at the University of Glasgow, Adam Carter and Mona Simeon. And they wrote an article that is published in a very complicated encyclopedia, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. A very interesting article that takes you hours to read. But I thought, look, in the beginning, I'm sure they define what trust means. And they define trust in a person or a group or a situation as a set of attitudes. So it's kind of a hybrid of feelings and attitudes. Things like optimism. I was optimistic I was going to be repaid. I had hope. Yeah, hope has something to do with it. Belief, and also some other sentiments. That's on the part of the truster. On the part of the person who is the trustee, there could be all kinds of things going on. In that same article, I read that I may be trusting the surgeon who's going to do my very delicate operation next month. But personally, I know that that person really is a jerk. I still want them to do that surgery, though. I trust them to do it. And trust is something, when I was reading more, it's something that is such that if it is betrayed, then there is some non-negligible harm that is done to the truster. In my case, the non-negligible amount of money that I was out of. So this optimism I had, it also relates to the motivations that the trustee may have had. Chris, in my example, eventually I could have gone to the dean or the provost and said, this person owes me money, and they said, oh, where's the paperwork? You know, there's that problem. So what makes a person trustworthy? Is it because there's a written contract? Is it because if you don't do the thing you're supposed to do, you might be arrested and go to prison? Well, that's not a good motivation. Well, it is a motivation. But I prefer to think that it is because they're good people. They have what we call goodwill. That's why they do the thing they had promised. And goodwill is not always enough. I wrote that little story in the Beacon Weekly News. No assigned reading, but it was about the turtle and the scorpion. I'm not going to ask if you read it, but the turtle is convinced to bring its friend, the scorpion, across the river by letting it sit on its back. And in the middle of the crossing, the scorpion stings it anyway, and both of them die. And on the way down, as they sink in the water, the turtle says, well, why did you do that? And the scorpion says, that's my nature. So that's something we need to take into account, especially when you get these interspecies kinds of situations of trust. Unlikely friends. I mentioned just a moment ago that reliance and trust are not the same thing. Trust involves a commitment that is made by the trustee. In Chris's case, the agreement to pay me back when the reimbursement check was received. I must tell you, eventually I did get the money, but it seemed like I was an extortionist at that point, But reliance does not involve commitment. For example, if I work in an office where a colleague regularly brings donuts for themselves to the office, but they can't eat them all, so they leave the rest sitting on the table. And the other colleagues, like myself, would say, "Ooh, donuts," and we eat them. So actually, we start to rely on there being donuts every day. We have reliance in this person bringing the donuts. We might be very upset when they don't. Like this morning, I was relying on a couple of things. I was relying on my alarm going off at that ungodly hour when it was really dark outside. And it did. There are many things I rely on. I rely on the fact that my iPhone indeed automatically changes the time. So I always think, is this really going to happen? But it does. I can rely on it. In the case of my dealings with Chris, there was a trust relationship. I trusted that the money would be paid back. Chris had made a commitment to me. Sadly, perhaps, it was not put in writing, and there was really no way of monitoring or forcing unless I turned into a really not nice person. Now, this kind of relationship I had with Chris is known in the ethics literature as a trust relationship that is called a three-place trust. There are three things involved. There's me, there's Chris, and there's the thing that was promised. So there's like 3 points on the corners of a triangle. I trusted that Chris would pay X dollars back to me. So there are 2 people and a specific thing. There's also what we call two-place trust. There's some people that I trust for everything. And two-place trust is much more general than three-place trust. For example, I may trust my neighbor who has been living next to me for decades, and I may trust that person or these people in general. Sometimes they cut my grass, sometimes they borrow my rake, but they return it promptly. And when I ask them to pick up my mail when I'm gone, they actually do it, So there are all kinds of things, and I can say, I trust these people. So that's a two-place trust, just between me and my neighbor. But they are related. Instead of just one thing at a time, all of these little things that actually work out, they work together to make up this trust that I have in this two-way relationship. Those are nice relationships to have. So much nicer than being around people who say, I trust no one. You better trust no one. Trust no one. That's the best rule. That's their motto. Yeah, and surely there are people who are untrustworthy, but trusting no one is really extreme, and it can lead to some terrible situations. And to a society that either cannot be built or that breaks down. And there are many stories about what happens when people don't trust. And here's a story about 2 Buddhists. You may have heard this. There are many stories about two Buddhists, but these particular two are traveling to a monastery, and they're hoping to be admitted there as monks, as apprentice monks. Sadly, on their way, they are robbed, and all their food and possessions are stolen. Well, when they arrive at the monastery, the abbot asks about their travel, and one of them tells the abbot about the robbery. More and more detail is forthcoming, and the abbot asks that person, that first applicant, "So what have you learned from this experience?" And the reply is, "It taught me to trust no one." "Ah," says the abbot, "okay. Let me ask this other applicant." They go in another room, and this other applicant is also interrogated. Pretty much tells a similar story. "What have you learned from the experience?" the abbot says. And that person's reply is, "Well, it seems that there are people who may be driven to do such things when they get desperate, because they're hungry or for some other reason. But that doesn't mean they are really bad underneath." Well, that's the person who gets accepted to be an apprentice monk in the monastery. And the first one, who was convinced that you should trust no one, is sent on their way. They are not accepted. How could you live in a spiritual community where compassion rules the day and have an attitude of trusting no one? Do you want to live with such people? Well, maybe we do, but not the people in that monastery. And this sort of gets to the notion that trust is really a valuable thing. It's hard to define, but it's valuable. Yes, sometimes one can get burned, but if there is no trust in a community, then that community is deprived of many things. And one thing that may not immediately come up in our minds is that trusting another person may lead to that person's emotional growth and character building. We do that with our children. If I allow my teenage child to borrow my car, and I stress to them that I trust them to drive safely and bring it back in good shape, this may, and I put the stress on may, it may help them grow up to be trustworthy. And this is something that we do when we educate children. Trusting builds trust. And a second thing, which is more obvious, is that without trusting relationships, it's not possible to cooperate with other people. It's not possible to solve problems cooperatively. It's not possible to build institutions that work properly, to build bridges and other physical things. Solving problems cooperatively leads to mutual benefit. We all benefit from that. A situation where everyone is better off. Sometimes I feel we need to say this louder in the communities we live in. But this sort of realization is really nothing new. This has existed in cultures around the world, and in Western culture, there was a lot of, written about this in the 16th, 17th century. And I remember reading the book by Thomas Hobbes. It's called Leviathan. It was published in 1651. And in this, well, he wrote a whole book, which was very, very tedious to read. But he wrote that whole book to justify the idea that a society must be organized so that people can work together. Now, in this time, that meant you have to support the king. Okay, we've come beyond that when we think about organized societies. But the ideas that he was expressing are still relevant. And he used 5 famous, memorable words to describe life in a society that doesn't have cooperation, where everyone is just in it for themselves, in the wild. And some people go into the wild and live by themselves. But he said, and these are his 5 words, it leads to a life where people are solitary, poor, a life that is nasty, brutal, and short. People always summarize house by saying nasty, brutal, and short, but it's more than that. Solitary and poor is really more important for our kind of society. So may we not foster a society where distrust is seen as a value. Trust is valuable. It intertwines with our Unitarian Universalist values. That's why it's a monthly theme. How can I be trusted? By practicing good things like equity, honesty, generosity, justice, compassion, reliability. Good moral values constitute that goodwill that I'd mentioned earlier, that goodwill that makes a person trustworthy relative to another one. So it becomes rather easy to draw a conclusion that is consistent with the theme of this month. We can live love through the practice of trust, and may it indeed be so. Let us now rise in body or spirit for our closing hymn, which is number 95 in the gray hymnal. There is more love somewhere. So that's number 95.